Hi, Stella.
Hi, Sasha.
So we are returning to a subject today that we recorded this conversation with Dr. James Cantor in 2022. We covered some unbelievably fascinating topics. He kind of told us about how he became a sex researcher, trying to understand his own background as a gay man. He talked about meeting Dr. Blanchard and being one of the first people to examine the lives and minds of autogynephiles and pedophiles. He talked about how activism has changed. We discussed the way scientists classify things in terms of taxonomy. And we talked about also, a program in Germany that aims to reduce offending by pedophiles. We talked about recidivism rates, and we covered such a broad range of absolutely fascinating topics. But we decided not to release it during the Pioneers series when it was recorded. And there was a reason why.
Yeah, and the reason was primarily because of me, because I suppose I was very proud of the Pioneer series. It was your idea, Sasha, and it was an amazing series. I felt it was one of the proudest parts of my work in gender was around this Pioneer series. And we were basically lifting up all sorts of different people's views, people's research, the people who were there decades ago. And just to hear what have they got to say now they're decades in the world, because so many of us are only 3, 8, 5 years in this world. And at the time, during the Pioneers, when that was going out, GenSpect was about 8 or 9 months old, and we were suffering an onslaught of extraordinary attacks. And it wasn't from a lot of people, but it was relentless. And it was a small number of incredibly vocal, incredibly extreme people were really, really attacking both myself and GenSpect. And funnily enough, there was one throwaway line in the Pioneer series that I think it was Mike Bailey made, that they kind of completely zeroed in on, and they took it out of context and they ran with it, and it was very, very distressing, and it really felt like we were in a fragile position. It felt like we hadn't earned our stripes, and people didn't really understand who we were and what we stood for. I think now it's over a year later. I think the Pioneer series has earned its worth. Like, people know that it's a good series. That of course we don't agree with everything that's said. We don't even try to agree with everything that's said. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to lift up different experts in the field and what they might say in any given context, and what the research says. And at the time, I contacted you saying, we can't put out James Cantor. It's too fragile at the moment. It's too histrionic. It's too distressing. It's too, it's really, really heightened. And of course, this is social media. And honestly, like, if you stand out of social media, it's a lot less heightened. So we made that decision. It always stuck in my mind that I would never want to, bow to a mob. And also, I don't ever want to be part of something that's stifling really important work. And mm-hmm. I do believe James Cantor, I know he has some unpalatable ideas, but I think he's a brilliant researcher, and I think we have to give respect to the work, and we have to think about, sometimes we have to think about unpalatable ideas if we're really going to have a deep understanding of any given subject. So it was always irking me that we had, as such, put this by, and I always felt I owed it to James Cantor that one day we have to bring this episode out. And so we're finally bringing this episode out, a full 14 months later, but we're bringing it out now, and I'm really glad we are. Nervous, but really glad.
Yeah. I listened to the interview again, and first of all, I think James Cantor is an amazing researcher. He's a brilliant mind, and when I was re-listening to it, first of all, after the heat of all of that controversy has died down, I'm in a very different place now. I listened to it again, and I thought, what I admire so much about Dr. Cantor is he has such care about precision of language. He makes sure that we use words very, very accurately, and he refuses to make leaps of logic based purely on emotion. And when I think about the point of our podcast series and the point of our work is that we fundamentally believe sometimes a statement or a stimulus or an experience can bring up a feeling in us. But the point is that we need to be able to examine the statement or the stimulus or the experience in a calm, rational, objective way as best as we can, because sometimes our initial gut reaction is going to lead us in an unhealthy direction. And frankly, I mean, after kind of exploring what the affirmative care model is, which we oppose pretty vehemently, it's based on, I want to make sure that I honor everybody's feelings all the time, 100%, no matter what. So I actually really appreciate Dr. Kanter's willingness to say, no, we can't be led astray by our emotions. We have to really try and understand the outcomes. And, you know, as anyone listening will hear, Dr. Kanter is very concerned with people's well-being and reducing instances of offending from people who are pedophiles, and making sure to keep anybody who might be at risk from experiencing that abuse on a large scale. So he's an advocate for victims, and he is very careful in the way he lays out his arguments. And I really would encourage listeners to kind of notice that in themselves, like what feelings are coming up, and can I stay objective, and can I really hear what Dr. Kanter is saying? And of course, you can agree or disagree, as we often invite people to do. Talk to people that you don't agree with, listen to interviews even if you don't agree. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very important that if research emerges that we don't want to hear, in a way, you can live like that, but sometimes, if it's very important, sometimes we have to kind of countenance the fact that some of the research mightn't suit us. It doesn't suit our worldview. Mm-hmm. And James Kanter is one of those researchers who just doesn't work like that. It's about the research. Now, you could argue, I would personally argue a lot about research. I think it's filled with issues, but that's not the point of, you know, that we still shouldn't suppress research. We should talk about it, think about it, discuss it. And if we don't agree, we should talk about it more and think about it more and discuss it more, and not censor it and not bring it down. And that's why I think it's so important that we give this opportunity to kind of discuss the important research, kind of trying to reduce the rate of paedophilia in his research. Like, he has some good, interesting ideas, certainly, and to hopefully that we come out of it better informed, and probably realising it's tricky. It's really, really tricky, and we don't know how to handle that in society.
Yeah. We'll say a little bit more about Dr. James Kanter. He's a clinical psychologist and sexual behavior scientist. For the past 20 years, he's been studying the nature and causes of sexual interests, from relatively familiar ones, such as heterosexuality, homosexuality, transsexuality, and asexuality, to rare and exotic phenomena, including vorophilia, which is sexual fantasies of being swallowed, and furries, people who have sex while dressed or cross-dressed as animals. The most widely discussed of his findings has been his research using neuroimaging and other techniques to isolate the causes of pedophilia and hebephilia, which is the sexual preference for prepubescent and pubescent children. His team's results have been published in the highest impact journals of psychology, including Psychological Bulletin, Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, and the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. Dr. Kanter regularly appears in the media internationally to discuss how society can better apply science to prevent sexual abuse and provide more ethical and effective treatment for people with atypical sexual interests. Interviews with him have appeared in CNN, NPR, The New York Times, and on Dan Savage's Savage Love podcast. Dr. Kanter is currently the director of the Toronto Sexuality Center and is the past editor of Sexual Abuse, a top research journal in the field and the official journal for the Association of the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. For updates and downloads, please visit his website, which we'll include in the notes. It's www.jameskanter.org, or follow him on Twitter at James Kanter, PhD. So here is our older but still incredibly relevant and interesting conversation with Dr. James Kanter.
Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we probe the gender landscape within contemporary culture.
And we consider the implications of prioritizing personal identity over other aspects of the self.
This is the thinking person's take on gender.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Sasha.
Hi, Stella. How's it going today?
It's going very well. As we get deeper and deeper into our Pioneer series, I feel really engaged with this. I feel really like we're actually following a golden thread of knowledge, and we're really getting to hear people that I just don't think have been heard in the long form. We see their studies, but we don't hear their thoughts and reflections. And so I'm very excited by our guest today.
Dr. James Cantor, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So can I just say, I first came across you when I was studying, as we all are in this gender world. I was studying desistance because I had my own experience of desistance as a child. And I came across the most valuable document, which was your analysis of desistance. And we might get into that a little bit later. But it was the most helpful document for anybody who was studying it from, 2016 to 2018, 2019. We were almost... That was the kind of North Star of desistance, that we could look at this document where all the studies of children who had desisted and all the studies of gender dysphoria in children had been collected, and you'd kind of provided us with this information. So thank you. And that's how you first came across my, I suppose that's how I first noticed you. But would you like to tell us how you first got into this whole field?
Goodness. Let's see. Way back when I was an itty-bitty little gay kid, I was figuring out that, oh my God, I'm an itty-bitty little gay kid. And so, just my natural personality, I'm just a curious kind of, I was just, how does anything work? And, figuring out, I was born in the 60s, so I was just figuring out that I was gay at a really, really tough time. There was no, we didn't even have the language. There was no such thing as gay marriage. I mean, the idea of gays in the military, gay was still in the DSM, where homosexuality of various terms was, it was a much rougher time then. And even as I learned to, develop the skin for dealing with that, that was just when the AIDS era just first started. So that whole world was just as one great big scary. And anyway, but I really was very lucky. My family, from the get-go was entirely supportive. And as they say, pardon the pun, I got to have a happy ending. But just being the nerdy kind of guy that I am, I was just scared. Why was I different? What made me gay to begin with? Very natural questions. I was hardly the first to ask them. So really my plan when I was young was to become a psychologist and to become a therapist for the gay community, exactly the way the therapist helped me coming out. That was kind of, the basic idea. And again, a pretty common story, certainly for a New York Jew. Now, so as I went through my studies, one of the I have to say it. It's not exactly relevant. I just can't help it. I got into graduate school. I started studying in psychology, and my first talk ever was just on the gay graduate student experience. Again, doing the very same thing that people are still doing today. Only I was in those days. I was the first one to do it. Wow. There had never before been an open, there were some senior professionals who were established, but for, at this point, a kid to say it was, right. And I actually even started the first committees on for LGB graduate students in psychology at the time. Anyway, so I gave my first talk, and in the audience was my now husband of 30 years.
Wow.
And that's how we met.
Oh, James.
Oh, my goodness.
Right.
So was he a psychology student as well, or a graduate student? Whoa.
Yep.
So cute.
Right.
It's pretty magical.
And it's only in retrospect that I said, oh, this is... clever of me. I'm stalking the audience. It's going to be filled with lots of gay men my age interested in the same thing. And the conference that year was in San Francisco.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, no, I on the way I was thinking, if I don't meet someone here, it's not going to happen.
No kidding.
So as I said, so that really was the start. We coordinated our applications. I had to go from a master's into a PhD program. We both got and so then both at McGill, and that's how I came to Canada.
Oh, it sounds like a little movie.
It really, again, for its day, it was a little bit more out of the ordinary than it is today. But it was
today that's like the most kind of home comforting, like vanilla story that you can imagine. But I'm sure back then it was a big deal.
It was also, it's nice to have a story that you can toast to in public and that your parents and grandparents can pass on, as opposed to the we met on Grindr.
Yeah. Yes. True.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. No. And of course, this is many years before Grindr. So
and I imagine this
old-fashioned in that sense.
I imagine this was in the 80s, the height of the AIDS epidemic type-y time, just judging by when you were born.
We met in 1991, and it was indeed at the height. Of it. I would have been right. I was 25 when we met, and it was indeed at its worst. And it also, I don't want to say derailed. It's complicated, but it impacted. Now, flipping to the scientific part, not only all of us in the world, but also the science. All of sex research was HIV prevention. Kathunk. That was all the money was diverted to that, slow start, Reagan era, blah, 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 blah. But sex research itself, every sex researcher, it was, from the point of view of many, money was just getting given away. The running joke was nobody ever turned down an AIDS proposal. That's what was going on.
It's like what's happening now with trans and gender identity research. Like, it seems similar.
There is no trans and identity research. That's exactly the problem. Nobody's proposing any research. They're just proposing mottos.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about the advocacy groups being able to kind of elicit large donations, and there's a proliferation of advocacy groups, which is different from research, of course. I'm just thinking about how, I guess, the issue of the time is really where all of the energy and attention goes.
Yeah. But I hesitate to make the comparison.
Okay.
Because in those days, a group meant a group. Physically in a room together, people talking under their real names. You had to go out and do something. Yeah. You couldn't Google a group, click on two things, call yourself a member, and everything was about number of likes, and who knows how many of these are bots. I mean, those were people, as I say, on real doorsteps, knocking on real doors, putting themselves in real harm's way.
Yeah,
unlike you couldn't do it anonymous like this now. So then it was activists had to be active. Today, it's not.
It's like keyboard activism.
Anonymous with a picture of a cartoon as your ID photo. That's not activism.
True. So true.
I know that you said that you kind of got into it to study how was I produced, basically. You're kind of thinking,
oh goodness, I got lost on my husband.
Yeah.
That's a good sign, I think.
Well, that depends on your point of view. When once men, even more than women, once we get north of 50, our memories aren't quite what they were. And I have become, it's very, very, again, for a science-minded person, this is rough. I really had to reorganize myself and get much, much better at note-taking. Graduate school met my husband, and the plan again was I was just going to become a gay therapist to my peeps, to the gay community. In those days, the T hadn't yet been added. And part of standard training for a PhD in clinical psychology is, of course, your internship. And there are very few sex-oriented such internships anywhere. One of them happened to be at the then Clark Institute of Psychiatry that had both a gender clinic for people who were, the official diagnostic term then was still transsexualism. And then they also had an other half, which was to work with sex offenders that I knew absolutely positively nothing about, but you needed two halves. So the half I was there for was, to train to be able to work with the T in GLBT. That was my goal. But the other half, again, I needed another half, and this was sex related. So here we go. Now in that other half was Ray Blanchard doing research on pedophiles, and he was just about to start on some studies on brain functioning in pedophiles. He wanted to study IQ and some basic, brain functional measures. By sheer coincidence, I actually had started in computer science before I came out, and part of coming out is when I switched to psychology. But as part of that switch, I was employed for 2 years as a research assistant in a neuropsychology lab where I was trained in giving IQ tests and cognitive assessments. So I had exactly the background that Blanchard needed. I was the missing piece for him to pull off this project to study the cognitive functioning in the brains of pedophiles. Right place, right time. It was interesting, he was proposing whatever project, and for the back of the room I said, but what about if... Ding! Well, and 10 years later I'm getting by then, our first grants to, pursue that with more studies, larger groups, and then the MRI studies to answer what I now learned was the bigger question. Where I used to be wondering, essentially just about me, what made me different, and that became the bigger question, what makes gay people different? And then it was running into transsexuals and pedophiles and people with, a much broader range of atypical sexualities gave me, of course, now the general question. What makes anybody into whatever they're into? And so now all of the other questions are just specific instances of the big question. How does the brain know what to be attracted to in the first place?
Well, that's a bit of a leap, I would have thought, because some people would say, well, hang on, being gay isn't comparable to, let's say, paedophile or transsexual, that you're comparing apples and oranges here. I would think people would say that. I'm sure people, I'm very, very sure that people do, and that's a natural instinct. And when I started this, I would have had exactly the same instinct. But once one takes oneself out of the picture, the thing that makes it, whatever sexual interest pattern distinct is our reaction to it. How it looks in society, how it fits in, whether it hurts somebody or not, all of which are perfectly legitimate, important social questions. But if you're a scientist, I'm asking about a glob of cells. What proportion of what hormones are in this kind of cell group versus that kind of cell group, and how does that proportion change, influence, whatever comes whether it fits into society or not doesn't matter at all to the glob of cells. But the moral implications, the ethical implications, the practical implications, the civil rights implications, all of those are perfectly valid. But if this sexual pattern is acceptable versus that one being not acceptable is not going to change, whatever it is in the brain, which parts are relevant, which parts are not relevant to science, that's neutral. It's helpful information knowing what is in the brain versus not, what does change versus not. Again, it is centrally important to we as a society managing ourselves, but we can't go backwards. We can't say because we like this one versus that one, this one therefore is in the brain versus not that one. That's not how it works. But who's to say it's in the brain? That's you. I'm not convinced it's in the brain.
Oh, again, perfectly legitimate question, and that is exactly the question that got me onto this. Now, of course, answering that question has been a 20-year long chunk of my career, and a fascinating question. Now, it's kind of funny how things have shifted over the course of that time. When I started at this in the 80s and 1980s, 1990s, was the height of what then was mostly being called social constructionism. Mm-hmm. The people with whom I was most unpopular then, or the controversial questions I was talking about then, were, was gay in the brain or not? In the early research on that, again, when one of the best known studies were a series by Simon LeVay, who first started identifying differences in, as I say, in these small cell groups, which led to more and more research. The best of which happens to be from Ray Blanchard, demonstrating the bottom line is that male sexual orientation, so homosexuality specifically in biological males, it appears to be a side effect of the immune response of his mother while he's in the womb. It's in the brain, it's inborn, but it's not a gene. It's not a gene that gets passed generation from generation. Any gene that gets passed is whatever atypicality or eccentricity it is of the mother's immune system. What appears to be genetic is the ability to produce gay children is what gets passed on, not the gayness itself. As I say, absolutely fascinating line of research. So when I started on this, the big debate was nature-nurture. And for sexual orientation, again, these were the big debates, and people were. It was important for people to know because it felt like it was so much of the gay rights agenda of that time depended on it, and it did. There was the sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit assumption that if it's built in, then we have to treat it like that forces us to treat it as acceptable. Now, if you focus on that argument isn't really true.
Correct.
I mean, there are many situations in which, those kinds of things do follow, but really it follows because it's our sympathy, it's our emotions that do. We imagine ourselves, what if I were born that way? What would I want? So it's related, but, a person's choices are a person's choices, what they want to do and their motivation for it. We as a society can't enforce mind reading. We can't ban a thought. We require people to regulate their own behavior according to what, poses potential harm to others. Perfectly legitimate. Okay. So these were the social constructionist days. And in those days, the lesbian community had a bit of trouble with me. I was what they called a biological essentialist because the evidence was showing that at least male homosexuality did appear to be this innate brain thing. Now, I'm very specific to say gay men and male homosexuality because for women, it's way more complex, as it very often is. Mm-hmm. So when you tell gay men, you were born like this, most gay men, yeah, I know. It just, as I say, from the get-go, there was no avoiding it. But for so many women, sexual attraction is not just physical. It's a big holistic, how do I feel about them, expectations for the future, what will my parents think, what will my friends think of me, it's this whole great big integrated ball of wax. So if there's something, unusual or atypical about the physical attraction piece, it's just one piece in the bigger picture. So for women, for lesbians, the idea that you're born like this, that doesn't feel true to a lot of lesbians the way it feels true to a lot of gay men.
It does.
And so that became a big debate at that time.
It does feel like a very male framework that, I've said it before, but I'll say it again for the hell of it, that it feels like a very male framework, this homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, get into your categories, off you go. And it just feels very male to me. And it's like, yeah, it's quite obvious that men constructed that framework. And I don't think it sings to women as a concept, if you follow me.
I agree with your bottom line, is that it doesn't ring true for men and women in the same way. It's male sexuality is not the equal and opposite a component to female sexuality. They're
yeah.
strongly related, but not equal opposite powers.
It's not a binary.
Correct. And but the part where I hesitate is I have no idea what a male theory is, what a female theory is. And I always and I hesitate to ascribe individual intention or desire to what's a mass of people, a cultural. Right, which is not to say they don't influence each other, but it doesn't have an intent like a person has an agenda.
There's something you jumped at, and I just want to go back because I'm very aware that you're very controversial in some circles, so I'll probably be a little bit more pedantic than usual, because what I want out of this hour is that everybody feels that they hear what you have to say, if you follow me, so that's quite clear about what you have to say. And you can go fast, and I don't think that serves for this because it's so important that we get things crystal, if at all possible. It seemed to me that you kind of lumped in homosexuality with paraphilias. And I'm like kind of going, hang on a second, can we just go back to that? Because why would you? Are these not two different things?
Yeah, the question that came up for me thinking about that is like, compared to what, right? It's almost a postmodern question because I'm like, well, compared to straight couples, I suppose all of these things are an anomaly to some degree. But I'm really curious about like Stella's saying, how did you decide what kinds of sexual proclivities would get lumped together in the way you think about this?
Basic science. I mean, I didn't do and have no need to do anything outside the pretty routine scientific method. We start with the null hypothesis.
Okay.
Period. No exceptions. The null hypothesis is there are no differences until you show me that there are. Okay. That means everything gets lumped together. Period. All of it. And it doesn't matter how anybody feels about it, if anybody's offended about being, associated with it. This is just basic scientific method. Because if I start with, this group is different from that group, there's no way to go backwards. There's no way to prove that they're the same. We start with the theory that they are the same and only separate them when the evidence shows, or that the evidence demands, the only way to explain the evidence is to show that they are different groups. Even though we feel differently about these groups here in society, and it's perfectly fine that we do, that doesn't automatically mean that there's something in the brain, that they have different things in the brain. That's, as we call,
what do they
an
have?
empirical
You
question.
said it was a blob of cells.
Hang on.
Sorry.
No. The one thing, the established already scientific principle is that, well, why don't we lump the regular everyday sexual people in with the atypical sexualities? That is, which is to say, why am I starting with those two groups? Why isn't just one great big group of human or male? And that is evolution. It's the regular everyday attracted to the opposite sex of reproductive range. Well, that's what enables. That's what evolution would select for.
Okay.
So we only have a question when, well, then how do we have the presence of these things that don't?
Got it.
Right. So we only have
anything that's unrelated to sexual reproduction would
anything that evolution wouldn't select becomes a question. Right. So if evolution isn't the thing that's maintaining the existence of these things, then what is? And so we start with a one great big group of what's right. So we start with a question. And now we can ask whatever question we want. And now it's, where are the lines? And the real question is, ultimately, what goes with what? Which of these are meaningful clusters? Is it gay versus everybody else? Is it everybody else is their own thing and they're all completely independent? Or are there something, or do they go together, in certain clusters, and we have a limited number of clusters and subclusters? Again, this is, to a scientist, this is the science of taxonomy.
Okay.
And it's well established, and it is exactly the same thing, exactly the same kind of procedures a scientist would use to classify, pick your phenomenon on the planet. Bacteria, birds, rock strata.
Sure.
We know things are similar or different if we can detect reliable differences that we can replicate to show
So-
that, this began a different way, and it's going to lead to something different, and it responds differently to different kinds of treatment. If it fits those criteria, then that's a meaningful way to separate these things.
And if you saw brain scans, are you saying that you can say that, you know, a certain person is homosexual, or are you saying that it is recognizable in a brain scan?
No, it's not that precise.
Thank God. Because that would be news to me if you had.
Oh yeah, no, and none of this, and that's not a secret. We, and again, this is how behavioral science and epidemiological science works. We look for patterns in large groups.
Okay.
So if, and one of my favorite examples is to just use, average height of men and women. Mm-hmm. And, if I just said men are taller than women, nobody would bat an eye. But if I say, here's a person 5'6", male or female, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Could go either way. Right, I could assign percentages, 70% this way, 30% the other, but it's just, the differences aren't large enough really to be able to say anything about one person, even though I can say something very, very reliable about groups of people.
So we've gotten
So same with the brain scans. It gives me clues as to where these things are coming from and what goes with what. But they're not at the level where I can take a brain scan and from that tell what a person is attracted to what. Now, given all of that, what the brain research has shown, that homosexuality is different from heterosexuality in a different way than pedophiles are different from non-pedophiles. So these are different axes. So you can, it's like you have a sex axis, you're attracted to male versus female, and an age axis. Well, that's more of a bell curve. You're attracted to reproductive age versus under reproductive age, the pedophiles and so on. And there does exist at the other end, the gerontophiles. They're attracted to older than reproductive age. So as I say, they're two independent axes, and both of those axes seem to be represented in the brain. The important part for society actually is the axis that people don't talk about, which is essentially the stuff in the brain that leads to antisociality, psychopathy, violence, inability to exhibit self-control. I mean, those are the things that are, dangerous. Now, that's the stuff, if we could detect that early, if we could, find a way to treat that, if we could, early detection, they're the dangerous ones. But people, now, when there is such a person, they're going to go rob, steal, hurt whoever it is they want to rob, steal, hurt. If that person's a regular, everyday heterosexual man, that kind of person is more likely to be a rapist. If he's attracted to children, well, that's the kind. He's more likely to hurt a kid. But the problem isn't the pedophilia per se, although of course such situations pull at us stronger. The brain problem is that antisocial, psychopathic. That's the axis we want to go for. The who he picks as victim. Is kind of secondary. If we could prevent him from looking for a victim, whom he chooses kind of becomes moot.
I want to ask you about that. I was kind of doing some reading from authors who might take a different perspective than you do. And one author said that based on her understanding, she was also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And she was saying that in her understanding, most pedophiles who do act out against children don't realize that they are grooming a victim, and the way they see it is they're courting a potential partner. And I'm wondering if you can share more about that. I mean, I'd love to read more research on that idea, but what's your experience? What do you know about that?
Oh, goodness. Each of those is a different question.
Okay.
The situation that she describes absolutely positively exists. Grooming, and even, and in the research we even use that term. Such situations do indeed exist and need to be dealt with, of course, appropriately. Where I'm hesitating is the most.
Okay.
Because, we don't have It's not like we can conduct a survey and everybody's going to tell us
Right.
and we can say, see, it was 23% of the... We have no idea what most is because so many of these cases go entirely unreported altogether.
Right.
So as I say, so her experience, that is as unfortunate as it is, that's not an uncommon experience.
Yeah.
But if we assume that her experience is the general experience or the cross-cutting experience, and that's the only situation that we're aiming our prevention methods at, we're going to be missing all of the other, unfortunate in our own ways kind of scenarios. So we need to be prepared and, work with hers. But when we start, and people do this all the time, and I can't blame them. If I had their experiences, I wouldn't be surprised if I had the same reactions they do. A lot of people walk in with, their set of experiences, which they're trying to, make sense of, prevent other people from going through, and they need their supports, and they gather around themselves other people who've been through similar stories, which makes sense. So they have that feeling that that's the majority case. That's part of their trying to normalize their own experience, heal, and move on. As I say, that not crazy, and I wouldn't be surprised if I did a similar thing if I were in their shoes. But we have no evidence that it's most. We need to simultaneously prepare for those grooming kinds of situations and these others.
What are the others? What are the others?
Of the cases that become known.
Yeah.
Interestingly, only about a third of actual child sexual abuse cases are committed by actual pedophiles. 2/3 of the cases, the majority of sex abuse cases, come inside the family from somebody who actually, a man typically, who actually prefers adults as sex partners but uses the kid as a surrogate because an adult isn't available to him for whatever reasons.
So that's going back to your antisocial kind of behavior, the lack of self-control being the problem.
It's, again, yes and no. A person with the general lack of self-control, this is only one of a long line of behaviors. They also have trouble with, whatever substances and gambling and spending. And this is just one, and this is one among them.
And empathy, maybe.
All of those are possible. I hesitate. Each of the adjectives that I asked about, all perfectly logical, but all trying to look for evidence of evil in this person. I do not blame you. That is the perfect natural response. And there does exist a chunk of these people for whom the word evil, really is a meaningful word. But if we start adding the less comfortable ideas, desperate, rejected, feeling unlovable, feeling that there's no alternative because of who knows what's... Again, I'm not exactly trying to evoke sympathy, these poor dears, but if we want these people to change their behaviors, we have to understand these people, how they see themselves.
And could I interject?
And only start there and then bring them to a more realistic assessment of what's going on.
I have seen you're writing that you basically said it is when they are desperate is when they carry out these acts.
That's humans. It's when humans feel the most desperate is when we're going to do the most desperate things. We need to, and all we're doing is now we're switching to the genuine pedophiles.
Okay.
The genuine pedophiles are in a different situation, emotionally, cognitively, sexually, than the genuine pedophiles, they're not using a kid as a surrogate. And again, this is one of the parts that's hard for a non-pedophile to understand. Just because their attraction pattern is about kids, their emotional range is the same as everybody else's. They get crushes. They experience love. They have a need, a craving to feel loved from the person that they feel attracted to. Now, again, my experience growing up gay does not compare to the, it was hard enough just getting a crush on, whatever fifth grade kid was sitting in front of me when I was just, in puberty. Never mind trying to hide that. Now we're asking these people to hide this from every person they ever meet, no exceptions, their entire life. We want them to succeed, right? Right, to me, the only logical thing is, well, come in where we can, whatever it takes. For some people, it's sex drive reducing medication. For some people, it's just venting for, an hour once a week just to get it off their chest. For some people, I can imagine, it's just fantasizing in their head about whatever it is they find attractive, just, as I say, mental imagination. The same way that anybody else masturbates. So it's... Right, it's only when they have the opportunity to do that we, can make a difference. Otherwise, we just send them underground where they, are more likely to feel more desperate and do something desperate.
And have you any sort of numbers or percentages on this? Like how many paedophiles do never commit paedophilia, if you follow me? Do we have any sort of rough
excellent
idea?
Question. No, there's no realistic way to measure that kind of a number. As I say, we can't do a Gallup poll and ask people, okay, how old of a kid are you attracted, blah, 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 and we're not going to get a meaningful response that way. We can only ask the backwards question. Out of the people who come to clinical attention... Out of the people who were caught, when we can test them, we can determine what proportion of the offenders are pedophiles, but we have no way to measure, of the pedophiles, how many become offenders. There's just no way to know that.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high-quality content for the show.
To take an even deeper dive and support the show, join our listener community for access to exclusive content, practical tools, and resources supporting gender and identity exploration. We're so grateful to our sponsor, GenSpect, an international organization which offers an alternative to WPATH, providing a range of education, resources, and supports to anyone impacted by gender distress. GenSpect unites many different organizations globally and gives voice to thousands of previously untold stories. For more info, visit genspect.org.
And thank you to our sponsor, RIME. Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And now back to the conversation. So, Dr. Kanter, you said something that I want to go back to. You said, even though there is this sexual attraction pattern, which is very unusual, or maybe unusual, well, I don't even know really how to say it. Not socially or morally acceptable to most people, okay? But you said the emotional range of these individuals is typical. So my question from that is, I assume the answer is going to be, well, it varies, but do a lot of these individuals recognize that the attraction patterns they have, if acted upon, would cause such devastation to the children victims? Do they realize that?
Yeah,
or is it a total delusion like, oh, this kid is actually really great for me and we should be together? Like, where is the sense of responsibility or vulnerability of the victim? I'm curious about that.
Excellent question. Both of those exist. It's the ones who fool themselves into believing that the child has an equivalent emotional experience. Those are the ones who, we usually find in forensic environments and have gone through with it because, they've worked at convincing themselves that this was not a bad thing. And, of course, the others exist. People who, let's say, a 12-year-old, at 12 years old, they're getting crushes on other 12-year-olds, just like all of us do. But by where the rest of us, our attractions, age with us, for them, they continue being attracted to 12-year-olds as they become 15, 16, 17, and until the contrast becomes large enough that they realize, Right, clam up, isolate themselves, and and those people, until relatively recently, we just never heard from. That we have all kinds of pressure, and they have every reason not to keep it secret to themselves, and it's only relatively recently that the clinical mental health environment is more trying harder to enable them to come in to get what support they need. So as I say, both groups exist, but there's no way to canvass or estimate the size of the population.
It occurs to me we could ask things like, what percentage of your fantasy life is completely unacceptable? We could get around it. We could get suggestions.
I have to go after an assumption in that question. To me, if it's 100% of fantasies are acceptable, they're fantasies.
But societally,
that's what they're for.
How many of them are societally acceptable to be enacted? You could get
that's
clever
a different
with
question.
The question.
No, I'm still on the first floor. That whether doing it in the real world is good or not doesn't matter. That's what makes a fantasy a fantasy. That's out of, again, to pick any of many analogies or metaphors. A guy in a monogamous relationship. Right, fantasizing other women. Every one of those counts as cheating.
You win.
Right, no, it's a fantasy. That's what it's there for. I want to beat up, punch, blow up.
Yeah.
That's right. It's supposed to be.
Okay.
That's where it belongs.
And it's actually clinically useful to leave space for that in a person's mind. I've seen some evidence of that, like emotion-focused experiential therapy, I think, encourages clients in fantasy only to act out. Like if you're angry at somebody, to act out, whatever your fantasy is about that person. And at least when I remember reading a book about this, and the therapist said what often happens after the acting out is another set of emotions. So for example, if you're raging at your father and you imagine brutally punching him or beating him up, what will happen next in the fantasy is you'll look at him and say, oh, poor guy, he's not really that bad or whatever. So I found that fascinating, and I had never really thought about it in that way. I don't know how this exactly relates to what we're talking about, but
it is dead on. It is and it's a classic conflict in a lot of doing therapy. Is the way through the emotion is through the emotion. Go through the wave, let the anger pick up. Again, it's the best the metaphor I use with my own clients the most, again, is we are bags of mostly water, responding to the same 4 F's. When we're angry at somebody, our choices are flee or fight. Ancient brain is telling us flee or fight, flee or fight. Those are the two. All the rest of upstairs is to just figure out the best way of fleeing and fighting. But the ancient part, the hypothalamus, it doesn't know the difference. Go punch a punching bag. To the lower brain, that counts. You did something. You fought. We're happy. And now you're ready to... Right. You've done. You've satisfied. You've scratched the itch. You've satisfied the ancient reflex to respond. That it actually had nothing to do with whatever the fight was about. Yeah. Oddly, to the emotions, it doesn't matter. To the upstairs cognitive part, that's one thing. But the raw emotion of it, as I said, running around the block, that's why physical exercise is so helpful for so many emotional things. We're just, tricking ancient hunter-gatherer brain into we either flew or fought. Right? And so it just... tackles the emotional reflex. So, okay, now I can think about it a little bit more clearly.
Could I ask you a few questions that I know a lot of people will want us to ask you, and they're difficult.
I do. Please, these are indeed complicated issues, and it's only by being born a Vulcan that I can process them now in a relatively objective way.
I know for many people, people think that it was absolutely unacceptable that you said a tweet, I think it was 2018, along the lines of the P should be in the LGBTQ acronym. And it was incredibly offensive to an awful lot of people. I don't get it. I don't understand why you think that. I kind of think, what is that and what are you thinking? So could you tell us?
Oh, happy to. And it's almost to the point where I want to call that tweet that tweet. Now, as you might imagine, that was inside of a thread, inside of a discussion and a context. Now, my disappointment in how people, or at least the people who kind of use that tweet for their own, attention-seeking purposes, my disappointment is that nobody actually picked me up on my question, which is the second half of that tweet, which is to point out to people that to do anything else violates the principles that gives the rest of us in LGBTQ our rights. What people have not figured out is, again, in the context of that general thread of, amongst all the atypical sexualities, what are the basic principles that give us our rights? Okay, let's identify those principles and now apply them equally, fairly, and the same across all of the atypical sexualities. Now, people kind of grab onto pedophile because it's the most evocative, it springs the most emotion, so it gets the most retweets, so that's what everybody hears. But of course, I'm about all the atypical sexualities. So when I talk about, who has what kind of rights, I'm going LGBTQQI, a gynandromorphophilia, asexuality, long strings and lists of sexual interest patterns that people have never heard of. And we're just putting pedophile at the end of the list because it's the toughest one to deal with. But if we can tackle that toughest one, all of the others fall into place. So as I say, really my question is, someone please articulate how you decide who gets into the alphabet. And if you can't tell me, then it's just a popularity contest, which is exactly why we needed this group to begin with, because we were fighting the popularity contest.
But you're presupposing that this is a sexuality, and I'm not even remotely convinced that it is. I would have thought it's a developed disorder. And, your sexual attraction, I would say, okay, people seem to be, and I buy your theory about the male homosexuality and female seems more nebulous. I get all that, but I'm like, I don't buy this idea that we're born with a paraphilia, any paraphilia. And I was very interested when Ray Blanchard said it's something along the lines of an erotic mislearning, an inability to correct an erotic fixation that would be considered societally unacceptable. He said something along those lines that we were born with. Do you understand me?
He said that we're born with proclivities, and environmental stressors can either exacerbate or perhaps inoculate the person from exhibiting those proclivities. And I've been thinking about this too. But I guess to add on to Stella's question, why does everything need to be in the acronym? And what does that have to do with rights per se? Like, don't all human beings, just by the virtue of being born in a certain country, have the rights of that particular country? Like, why does...
Yeah, because I think...
What about pedophilia needs to be in LGBT in order to ensure what rights? Like housing rights? What rights are we talking about?
And can I add in, why didn't you say H for heterosexuality or HE or something? And why didn't you say A for autogynephilia? Like, if that's where you were going...
Yes, you're seeing it exactly. How do we decide? What does it mean to be in that list? All of those are legitimate questions. But nobody... Right, everybody is in the, oh my God, no, only the people I like are in the list, not the people who make me uncomfortable. Well, to me, that's the height of hypocrisy. You're in the list according to who's comfortable? Well, if that were true, there'd be no list at all. Well, so if it's not about comfort, what is it? Is it about, actually what we're going to put in law? Well, then why is there a Q? Who is this exactly? Who's in Q? Who's not already included? If being in the list means we all get the same civil rights, then what does it mean to have T in there with L, even though these two groups are at war with each other? Do Bs need to be there? Well, if it's about behavior, well, being B isn't relevant to that. It's just they're there because they're already either half L or half G and B. As I say, I'm asking, or at least I'm pointing out that this is a slogan. What does it mean to be here? If you can't tell me what, in an objective way, who's in or out, it's either everybody who's just atypical and needs help in living their atypical life in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. All right, yeah. Well, then we need to include. Then they should be included in that.
Your acronym was basically a takedown. It was a provocative takedown of the concept of the acronym.
I'm pointing out that nobody's even trying to ask the obvious question. They're arguing who should be in or out without saying, how do you know?
Well,
on the basis of what? Says who?
Well, one thing that seems to come to mind pretty obviously is that if you are, let's say, LGB, let's leave T out for a second, acting upon your orientation is considered societally normal within the bounds of what we consider ethical and fine. It wasn't always that way, but it is currently at this particular state of time. So to me, it's pretty easy to see why L, G, and B clearly belong in the acronym as something that a person might say, I'm proud to be part of this group. Acting on the P is not legal and it is not societally acceptable. So to me, that seems like a really big distinction. Popularity contest, you could call it that, but we're also talking about both legal and moral implications, I guess.
Kink?
Well, I don't know if I think kink should be in the acronym in and of itself. So I'm probably more of
There's
an
a whole BDSM rights movement, flags of their own. They got floats in the parade. Now, I'm not saying I have the answer to who belongs in or out, or what what the objective criteria should be. I'm just pointing out that so far we're treating this as a popularity contest, which to me is hypocritical. We're there because we lost the popularity contest, and so we need to band together. Some of us are just lucky that we actually get to engage in whatever our interest is in the real world. Not everybody is so lucky. For some people, again, pick your numbers. Regular everyday het guy, he gets to pick from 50% roughly of the population, in theory. Gay guy gets to pick from roughly 2%. And down the line to people who have fantasies that cannot be enacted because of physical limitations and physics. Okay, their lives, they have some interest pattern that has to be limited to their fantasy. Does it matter if it's for ethical reasons versus physics reasons? Do we, these are people who grow up with, oh my God, what's wrong with me? And then they need help. They know they can't act it out in society. So we're going to say, sorry, therefore, we won't cover this. We won't cover psychotherapy for this. Nope, sorry, we won't band together and say, yeah, we know it's tough that you have to cover this, but you're not alone. Sorry.
What do you think?
You're going to have to do this alone?
What do you think we should do with, let's say, a paedophile who has been tested as such, or who is a self-admitted paedophile but hasn't committed crimes? What should we do? And even those who have committed crimes, where do we go?
Yeah, is there research about how to effectively ensure that individuals with those proclivities don't act out? What do we know about that?
All excellent questions. Now, of course, we only have limited ways to be able to ask these questions because we can't, do a survey of the typical pedophile, follow them up for 10 years and see how many offended. We just can't do that kind of research. The windows through which, we can peek are the statistics and the forensic statistics that we have. But the best project in the world actually is in Germany. It started with it's called the Prevention Project Dunkelfeld. Dunkelfeld is a German word that they invented, which just means dark field, essentially the underground. The nature of the psychotherapy confidentiality laws and the mandatory reporting laws in Germany are such that if somebody here in the I'm in Canada, the U.S. is the same way. If I discovered, or if a client of mine tells me that he's abusing one of his kids, I of course have to report that to the authorities in order to protect that kid from any more abuse. In Germany, patient confidentiality is higher than that. If that were said in Germany, the mental health provider is not required to report it. That, as a side effect, enables people who want help stopping what they're doing to come in and say, "Doc, this is a compulsion. Doc, I tried, but..." So now we have those people who are available for study and interview and question, and what can we learn from them and follow them up. So as I say, it is an exquisite and very, very important window that can guide us in other jurisdictions to, right, now have an alternative that's meant to prevent, rather than just in theory. Here we think we're actually preventing by mandatory reporting.
Well, no, I want to just say, as a mandatory reporter, we're saving the child who's being abused in that case.
No, you're not.
How?
You're preventing the person from telling you that he's committing the abuse in the first place. We have mandatory reporting, but we also have informed consent, in which we are required to tell them at the beginning of therapy, these are the things that I would have to report. It says child abuse. So he knows. Telling you is telling the authority, so he just doesn't tell you. We do not save anyone.
But I'm wondering, okay, let's say a child... I'm kind of curious about this German system.
It does, however, make us feel better and feel like we did, but all we've done is shove the problem away to where we can't see it and congratulate ourselves on our virtue. All we've done is participate in burying a problem. If we didn't have this law, the person would be able to come into therapy, would be able to tell me, and at least I have a chance of helping them. Mandatory reporting just makes us feel good. It doesn't stop the victim.
But I'm thinking about cases where, how would this work in the German system? Let's say a child reports that they're being abused. I know it's not the perpetrator saying, "Hey, I've been doing this bad thing and I want to tell you." If a child reports, what happens at that point?
Exactly the same thing. Or if a neighbor discovered it, then absolutely, their version of their child protection services would kick in, just like the rest of us. The only thing that's different is in their system, the mandatory reporting has a different priority with doctor-patient confidentiality.
In effect, do the therapists, do they ultimately tend to report after some time if they find that the client just is continuing to abuse? Like, I would imagine
they can't. That would be a violation of doctor-patient confidentiality.
Oh my gosh!
And are you saying the results are good in Germany?
Right. Hang on. Your reaction, perfectly natural, and everybody listening to this is going to have exactly the same reaction. That reaction is, of course, oh my God, right, somebody told me this, and our natural reflex, what do I do? How am I going to sleep tonight knowing that this is gonna... Natural reactions, and right, it is a tough position to be in. So, right, we kind of want to report in order to protect the kid. Caution number one. We're now doing it out of our own emotions.
Well, in fairness,
we want to We want to do it because it will make us feel better. Number two, what if we do report it? What if we say we will absorb whatever the legal ramifications are, and I do call, okay, and the kid is saved, and I stop this one case? What happens now the day after that? Yeah. Every other pedophile seeing every other client in the country leaves. And all of a sudden, nobody's saying anything. You think you've saved the one, but actually you have harmed all of the other cases, plus all of the ones in the future, because now they won't go in and tell anyone.
I know that, but
it just made you feel better.
Well, in fairness, I did immediately ask, what are the results of this German project? How do we know it's so good? How do we know that this system is so great? I'm open to it being so great, but I was like, well, then, what are your results, though?
Yeah, excellent questions. And it's, again, part of this is going to be answerable, part of this is not. We have this unusual window, or exceptional window, I should say, because they have this different structure. But we still have the big dark field, and we don't know how big that field is. We don't know what the denominator is. So even though we'd see, okay, these number of the cases who come in, this is what happens. All right, that's, here where the lights are on, where we can see it. But how many people would have come in otherwise? Again, is that great big? There's just no way to know it. What we do know, in practice, of the people who do come into the therapy systems, the Prevention Project Dunkelfeld in Germany, again, the ones come in very, very unusual, a small handful actually engaging in or saying that they're engaging in hands-on offenses. A large chunk of them are engaged in child porn of various forms. Now, again, it's people automatically, people hear the phrase child porn and people, again, it's emotionally evocative. People instinctively think of the worst possible case, which is photographic evidence of a kid getting hurt. Correct. And again, for when that's going on, that's the kind that we need to treat with the full weight of the law. The great majority of these, I'll now use a more nebulous term, materials are fiction, drawings, photoshopped images. There is no kid getting hurt. We're now back into fantasy stuff. All right. Who are we helping by banning this? Right, and now we're starting to get back on we're banning it because it makes us uncomfortable.
I have to ask you about two things now, because I know people are going to say you're destigmatizing things with this sort of approach, and also you're legitimizing these issues with this sort of approach.
Because I don't know what normal is, and I'm not, growing up gay kind of at this point made me, I'll say, immune to stigma. I always have difficulty processing either one of those. But usually, those are people are usually making an implicit, have a couple of implicit assumptions. To say that I'm destigmatizing anything, that's not exactly true. I think it's much fairer, more accurate. I'll go with precise. To say that I'm fine-tuning what it is that's getting the stigma. Really the underlying message, and of course I say it over and over again, it's often the first sentence in any essay I write on the topic, is to separate, again, pedophilia, the sexual attraction pattern that they didn't pick and can't change, from the actual abuse and harm of another person, the actual child molestation. So I'm not saying destigmatize, the actual harmful crime. I'm just pointing out that the stigma belongs to the crime, not the fantasy. What's the point of stigmatizing something that they didn't pick and can't change? So it's not, so when people, I'll make air quotes, accuse me of destigmatizing pedophilia, they're saying the word pedophilia, but really they're thinking child molestation. I'm not. I'm pointing out that the stigma belongs to the part that's harmful. The part that's harmful is the overt behavior, not the fantasy. And I am pointing out that if we stopped stigmatizing the fantasy, then we might be able to decrease the prevalence of the actual behavior.
And what about legitimizing the position of the paedophile?
I have no idea what legitimate
means.
I
suppose...
Legitimate to who?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what I'm thinking of. As far as
Yeah.
I know, you were on the board or the advisory council or something of the Prostasia Foundation, and I don't know what the Prostasia Foundation, seeks to do. I know that
Yep.
a lot of people believe it is just effectively a front for more nefarious kind of mission. And I would think, okay, well, if you're going to join a foundation that is legitimizing paedophilia, for example, and I don't know if it is, but other people think it is. So yeah, I wonder what you say to that.
It's exactly the other way around. Once when I started doing this kind of research and this solid evidence demonstrating that this is a brain phenomenon that was coming out, to the professionals, this had a very logical implication. All right, given that they didn't pick it and it can't change, the only thing we can do is help people, maximize the skills for managing it. Okay. And, I was the first scientist doing it. I'm known for being a good speaker, so I was in the perfect, place to be able to get this idea across. Now, I was also a leader. I was editor-in-chief of the journal Sexual Abuse, so I was about as legitimate a scientist. I was the head of the peer review process in my field. I was the definition of this guy knows good science of all kinds. So my saying it again got people to much more substantially rethink how we did therapy and what kind of policies were in place. Again, now we're going back 15 years-ish. That now, again, among professionals has become the standard thinking. What we need to do is help these people manage whatever situations it is that they're in. As time went by, now professional groups have formed themselves exactly around this, exactly around the punitive after the fact thing. We can do better than that. We have an opportunity now for prevention. And so, to prevent, most of the system is about vengeance, or, which we euphemistically called justice often. But it's still after the fact, after there's a kid harmed, after there's a victim, where, as I say, my real goal, or the goal of these professionals, if we can get through before there's a victim, now we're talking. So these groups started forming groups of professionals saying, we know what the reporting guidelines are, and we're here to help. Here are the limitations. And research groups, including these professionals, are also starting to form throughout the U.S. here and here in Canada. I would have to look in the U.K. I can't say that one comes to mind automatically. However, there do also exist, groups of unethical pedophiles, trading unethical porn, in the dark web. They also exist. But because I had a position where my being a part of anything kind of demonstrated the scientific legitimacy of a group, I became either a patron or a member of the board of directors of, the legitimate groups who really were trying to do genuine good. And the Prostatia organization is one of those. They are trying to enable situations that help pedophiles come in to ask for help, and for the various whatever initiatives in the various jurisdictions to enact genuine prevention projects, not just, as I say, this reflexive, vengeful after the fact that just it doesn't really, in a foreseeable way, reduce very many crimes. And so I was a member of a lot of these, again, to help them distinguish which ones were legitimate from not. I'll say accusations. There exist people who are, highly emotional, really reflexive, or they're working out their own histories of abuse, which is no easy task. There's no evidence to suggest any untoward basis of anything having to do with Prostatia. It's just, oh my God, if you're supporting pedophiles, you must be a pedophile. I get called a pedophile all the time. And
or a pedophile, you're somebody who's trying to legitimize and platform and
sympathizer,
support.
kind of.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you don't agree 100% with my radical view, then you must therefore be 100% of the opposite radical view. The idea that there's a complicated middle ground and it depends in its context and different people need different things, with a level of emotionality, it's really tough for people to, as I say, once the 4 Fs, fight or flee. Once that's engaged, the upper brain stuff is pretty hard. And so it's just kind of that. If you're not, saying how evil if you're not talking about, pushing these people into wood chippers, you must be one of them.
I know, and I hear you, but I mean, this is something that I personally struggle with some of the highly research-based clinicians and professionals and academics. It's like, I think our emotions are also a really important alarm bell. And so I wouldn't want to dismiss people who do make emotional arguments, because there's something really important there to listening to. Like, if on an instinctive level, something comes off as being really threatening or like egregious to a large chunk of people, there's something important about that can perhaps guide us on, how we should be approaching these topics or how we should think about them. And I know that's not a very kind of evidence-based way to talk about it, but it is a very human reaction that there are certain things that
has served us well.
We know it's a slippery kind of slope, and I know that changes too over time and in different cultures, but I do feel like there's something really important to that.
Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely positively correct. Now, it's kind of funny, despite, this is one of, many controversial topics that I study. For me, that's
I know, I wish we had more time to listen to all these other interesting things, but go on, yes.
To other people, they stay away from these flames. To me, this is just, a nice little sauna heat. This is a spa day for me. Now, again, even though I'm involved in these very many of these controversies, I myself have never been controversial. I just study controversial shit, so no matter what I say, large numbers of people are going to be unhappy about it. My point of view, and again, I can't say that it doesn't come back to this is how I grew up. Large groups of people were really upset that I was gay. So when large numbers of people are upset with something I think, fuck them. I don't care. I learned to be immune to this a long time ago. I'm following what the evidence says. This is what the evidence says, and if everybody else wants to think the world is flat, that's not my problem.
Okay.
I'm the scientist. Here's where the evidence is, period. Two. Two. Oddly, despite that, one can hardly say my name without the word controversy appearing in one of the next 2 or 3 Google hits, I am probably one of the least controversial people speaking on this issue. For comparison, Alan Walker.
Tell us, who's Alan Walker?
Alan Walker recently wrote a book saying essentially very much what I just did, and how we, can in a reasonable way integrate people born with sexual attractions to children, and how we can integrate them in a healthy way in society that, as best as we can tell, decreases the potential risk of harm for children. Controversy, essentially booted out of his research position at, I don't remember the university where he was. A Columbia University professor in the 1990s pointed out that not every victim of childhood sexual abuse is automatically harmed by it. That statement resurfaced recently. He's now out. And so on and so on and so on. Zucker getting fired from CAMH, and so I've never been through any. That never happens. I have never been involved in anything more controversial than right, an unpopular, a controversial tweet that people retweet, taking it at a context. So oddly, out of the people who are talking about these highly controversial and highly evocative topics, I kind of, again, because I've been at it this long, I've been talking about, more of these topics than other people, and I somehow came out okay. I'm wondering if I'm the one who got this the right way, and if it's the radicals who if there's a way for me to approach these people from anything from tweet to blog to, whole documentaries, reenacting my research program, if there's a method to communicate that I haven't tried yet, I'm open to hearing it. But if it's me versus the masses, I'm with the evidence. I don't care what the
Okay.
masses say. It's up to the masses to listen to the scientist. Don't look up.
You say you have the evidence, and we've been talking for
Yeah.
an hour, over an hour here, and there is one other thing I want to talk about, but I still haven't heard you tell me the evidence that somebody is born with paedophilia.
Yeah.
Well, is that the question? Because I'm trying to figure out, because we're talking about so many things
God,
with so
yeah.
many implications.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm don't think it's that shocking that some people have innate proclivities that don't fit into the normal society. I don't find that to be particularly controversial. I think what do we do about it is really tricky. But yeah, I guess, what is the evidence?
Yeah, I just haven't heard the
yeah,
famous evidence.
Legit question. And as I say, there have been whole documentary films, kind of reenacting the research. It's none of this is at all a secret.
Okay.
Now, the bigger question, again, for a non-brain scientist, all of this is, part of the big question. How do we solve the nature-nurture problem? Clunk. And that's true, right, for gay stuff that, I'll say, set the modern precedent because so much depended on it in its days. Now, the way it worked out with pedophilia is, what phenomenon, what features of human behavior is it that we could measure that would give us a clue to brain structure? But of course, the people available to me were primarily offenders. Diagnosed formally as pedophiles, now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and I'm trying to figure out what happened before they were born. Right, that's a tall scientific question. The early studies, as I say, the first studies, was Ray Blanchard's idea, essentially just measuring IQ, which is, you can think about that as like the blood pressure of the brain. It's just a basic overall, how healthy is this brain? Again, won't tell me much about one specific person, although it was very useful, for getting the right person into the right kinds of therapy. But when I start, like I was saying before, when I start comparing whole groups, I now get to see patterns that aren't apparent when I'm looking to an individual person. For example, it wasn't merely that that these sex offenders against children had lower IQs than offenders than average. It was even lower than offenders against adults, and there was a direct correlation. The younger of the kids they offended against, the lower the IQ.
Whoa.
Right.
Whoa.
All of a sudden there's a pattern here, and it's not so easily explained by... Right. Why would there be a phenomenal pattern between somebody who offends against an 8-year-old versus a 12-year-old?
What about, I saw height. You had height as one of the criteria, you noticed, that they were shorter.
Because of course, it's when I'm interviewing, every different thing I can think of about a pedophile, I'm looking for evidence of how healthy this person was during development. And physical height is one of those things because it doesn't change over the course. It doesn't change in adulthood, until we get old. So height was one of the things that would tell me, again, in an individual person, it doesn't tell me a thing. But when I start seeing, again, another example of this direct relationship, now it says, okay, during development, including prenatal, but also during childhood, nutrition, stress effects, but it's not something that changes in adulthood. So, for example, there was a legitimate question. All the people available to me committed a crime and were in jail. And they only came to me as they're being released and onto parole and probation. That's when they came to our facility.
So arguably only the more stupid got caught, and therefore there was less.
But you couldn't argue that only the short were getting caught. Again, we're now seeing a pattern.
And you couldn't argue
that
the graph either.
Right. Exactly. Now, the I'll call it the smoking gun was, again, most people didn't think of it. left-handedness.
Oh, yeah.
Left-handed versus right-handed.
this.
And so far as brain is concerned, ambidextrous goes with left-handed. The hand, your dominant hand, it goes to the opposite side
Right,
of the brain.
that's right.
By coincidence, I'm left-handed, so I'm probably right brain
So
dominant. Where most men, especially, for most men, right hand dominant and left hemisphere dominant.
Okay.
Now, but, so in the average population, it's somewhere 10%-ish are non-right-handed. As I say, ambidextrous
Okay.
goes with left-handed. But it was 30 and 35% of the pedophiles.
Huh.
Okay. Brain development, hemispheric dominance is established in the first trimester of pregnancy. If these people are 3 times more likely to be non-right-handed than they should be, something was different about them. It had to be in the brain, and whatever chain of events that led to it, the first links of that chain have to have been present in the first trimester of development. There's just no other way to explain this pattern.
Or people who are left-handed are more, which I am, are more likely to be right-brained and therefore perhaps more likely to act in a certain way that could end up that you are a paedophile in prison.
It is indeed related to disinhibition and those kinds of things, but the percent difference in there it's a tiny difference. As I say, if it's 10% in the mainstream population, then amongst the antisocials and so on, it's like 13-14%, not 30.
Okay.
So as I say, there's just no other way. And of course, if I'm wrong, I want to know it. I want to be the first one to. So I have thought of and looked into every possible alternative explanation. There, of course, there will always be somebody else. There's always another possibility. But so it's basic science, basic scientific method. Find every alternative explanation, and neither I and now we're going on 20 years. No one else has come up with another way. Right, and I compared these people not just to regular everyday. I compared these people to people who committed other kinds of offenses. So I have, criminal versus criminal. It's just that these criminals are also attracted to children. Whatever brain differences there are, it's really hard to say it's because of criminality, because my control group were criminals.
It doesn't feel like a smoking gun. You've got handedness, which is 3 times.
The smoking gun is what... right, but whatever is different, the first chain of it had to be prenatal. I don't know. It's quite possible that, for example, the thing that went different is whatever hormonal or protein enzymatic thing, which leads to differences in laterality is the formal term, and therefore handedness. But, some other thing further down the line is what gives rise to pedophilia. All of that is perfectly possible.
Did you guys test
But the simplest explanation so far, until we have evidence that makes us have to say something else, principle of parsimony. Again, basic scientific method. The simplest explanation. They're born with it. It's innate. Right. A different pattern from homosexuality, which, as I say, it's a different.
And your big point, just
pattern.
To save you, is just because they have it doesn't mean they're acting on it, and to act on it, they have to have other traits. I'm just saying that for your own.
Correct. It's right. It's this complicated web of interacting things. But the simplest explanation so far is that they're born with it. And the social policy implications, ethical implications are, well, if we can't change them, we have to help them manage it. Any of us could have been born with this pattern. It's just that it's so uncomfortable to imagine, and we are so aware of the harm of the victims. It's really hard to try to drum up the empathy for being born that way. But as I say, the goal of it, if we can get comfortable with that one, all of the other atypical sexualities become a relative piece of cake.
I know I have to go after this, but I'm trying to remember. I had heard this interview a couple of years ago with a woman with pedophilic proclivities, which was very unusual, I guess, statistically. And she was talking about, well, first of all, she was hyper aware of how totally destructive it would be if she ever acted on her proclivities, and so she never did. But she was talking about what you said earlier, which is when she was young, she was attracted to other kids her age, and then she kind of aged up, but her attractions didn't change. And it was remarkable, first of all, because I think, honestly, I had never actually looked into pedophilia very much. And I think because this was a woman, I felt a little bit less terrified and threatened to hear her out, I guess, if that makes sense. And listening to her talk about this was just absolutely remarkable. And I'll never forget that conversation, because she had her voice disguised, and she, of course, didn't share her name, but she was hyper aware of how dangerous it would be if she, even for a moment, like allowed herself to think this is something I could do in real life, or this would be okay, you know? And I think that consciousness about her experience is really what would separate somebody like that from someone who I think is dangerous and talks themselves into this fantasy that this is fine.
And of course, it's the ones who do talk themselves into that are the ones that we see. They commit a crime. They're the ones getting caught. Those are the ones we see. But majority, minority, tiny sliver. There's no way to know.
There's an awful lot unknown, really, in this field. I know I saw a documentary myself, different than Sasha's, but it was a man who it was a UK documentary, and he said, I have paedophilic tendencies and I have sought help and there is no help. What do I do? And he went and made a TV program. You know what I mean? So he was not committing the crime as such, but there was no crime.
Yeah.
He had thought crime and he wanted help for it. And are you saying that if you're listening to us, and if you have paedophilic tendencies, you're saying that there is programs in Germany that could help you?
Or even here. Yes. I mean, where are programs to help people here?
Oh, goodness. I wish I had listed them so I could...
How about this? You can send them to us.
Oh, okay.
I'll
do that. There's one started... There's one in Canada, and there's one in the US I have in mind. I'll send the details to you so anybody
and they
can
actually work, because I thought recidivism in this is really, really high, and it doesn't work. That they're fixated.
No, it's not. That's one of the myths. Actually, recidivism is very low. Once a person is apprehended, the very few of them go on to commit another offense. As I say, it's somewhere in the 15%-ish range. I think a lot of the public confusion is because over the most recent generation, over the most recent 20 years, there have been more and more uncovered instances of these. I can only call them string offenders, institutional offenders in churches, the Boy Scouts, and so on.
Church.
But those are the ones who weren't caught. So as they were not being caught, they could string up large numbers, and so we have this, so and those are the ones, that really grab at our heartstrings. Yeah. They're the most dramatic. So we have that slants the public view, but once a person is caught, they rarely even have the opportunity to do it. They're never in contact with another child, and as I said, that's or they've learned their lesson, or they've been in therapy. Take your pick. But recidivism is much lower for those crimes than just about any other.
I'm definitely going to check that out. But I believe
you. If you will send us those resources, I'd love to see them.
I would love to have them.
And of course, we'll also include resources for anybody who is a survivor of abuse. This is a very, very difficult topic, and we're really grateful to have had you on and to kind of talk through these issues together. And I think it's very important to bring all of this into the light so we can see it with more clarity.
It's a fascinating field, I say, in my objective. best. But you're right, it's a really, really tough topic because it's so tough to be objective about it. Most people come to this topic through, right, the most heinous of circumstances. Mm-hmm. Right, it's easy for me to say, don't be emotional. This hasn't touched me in a personal kind of way. I'm set up to be objective about it. But as I say, the value in it is if we can grapple our discomfort on this one, we can grapple our discomfort on any of them. And the lesson, although we didn't get, I'm surprised we didn't get to talk more about gender issues.
So am I.
But it's a similar kind of story. It's just stand up regardless of what the numbers are, who likes it, who doesn't like it. And it's very strange. When I was young, I was getting attacked from the right for what I said about trans issues. What I've said hasn't really changed much, but now I get attacked.
Okay.
Well, I should say from the other side.
We really have to finish on this question, but do you think, therefore, being, a proclivity towards being trans is innate, that you're born that way?
Different people think that they are trans for different reasons. Some of them seem to have a stronger link to innateness than others. Mm-hmm. One of the maybe the biggest pattern, I'll say, going on in a lot of the trans discussions is people are taking, scientific findings which were made very precisely with a very specific group of people. Then they use some very broad, very general terms, so it seems like it applies to people that it has nothing to do with, and then express that using the most extreme terms that they can think of, and now it just is saying the opposite of what the original study did. So this is one of those. So when people are saying trans, it used to mean people who actually wanted, people who were transsexual, people who really were on the path to changing sex. Now it essentially just means anybody who likes some masculine stuff, some feminine stuff, which is pretty much everybody. Mm-hmm. And now it's just a fashion label. So is it innate? What we used to think of as, the actual transsexuals, we have evidence that that's pretty close to innate in different ways. And again, the story is a little bit more complex. But this, relative, the recent explosion of everybody calling themselves trans, there's no evidence to suggest that they are, experiencing the same phenomenon that the full-blown, if I can call them that, transsexuals are.
Well, I'll put to you, Dr. Kantor, listen to our episode with Paul Vassie. It's really interesting because we get into this question of innateness. Yes. I'm sure you know Paul.
We go way back. I've listened to your episode with Ken Zucker, which I enjoyed, and I'm halfway now through listening with Steve Levy.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us about this. It's been really, I've been glued to the edge of my seat really the whole time. So me too. It's very interesting. Oh, thank you.
Delighted. It's, as I've often said, I don't know why everybody isn't a sex researcher.
I'm glad not everyone is.
One way or another, I sometimes wonder if we are.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. Listener support means a lot to us. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe on iTunes and leave a review.
For more information, visit widerlenspod.com. There you'll learn about joining our listener community, how to contribute to our show, and where to find us on social media.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.